It is wonderful to be here with all of you water people, water advocates, practitioners, students of water all. Actually, we're by definition all water people since our bodies are comprised of 70% water. I like how Brock Dahlman of the Water Institute, he spoke earlier today, likes to sign his emails, mostly water. I think that's perfect. World Water Day is a good time to rethink how we look at water. We often talk about water as a noun, as a thing that's bounded by place. The word resource often locks us into that box. So water is seen as something that I have or you have and I can take it or sell it to you or have a, do a lawsuit about it. Water privatization, I'm looking at you. But I think it's also important to understand water as a verb. Water is always in motion. It expands in volume or retrenches. It retains or releases energy. It changes state, moving from gas to liquid to solid and back again in an ongoing dialogue with land and sun. I believe that understanding how water works, how it moves across the landscape and through the atmosphere, will help us address our many global challenges. Because water interacts with every system, climate, biodiversity, food security, and the way our landscapes function. So here is a plug for water literacy, for learning about water and learning from water, so that we can better work with water rather than trying to get water to do what we want it to do, which, as we've seen, doesn't serve us, doesn't work out so well. A wonderful journalist named Erica Gies has a book coming out in June with the title Water Always Wins. I'm very much looking forward to the book, but I also want to make the point that it needn't be a zero-sum game, that we and all life can win too by understanding, honoring, and working with water. Let's linger for a moment on climate. I know, let's start out light. One reason I wrote a book about water, that the book is Water in Plain Sight, Hope for a Thirsty World, is that whenever I saw the connection between water and climate, it was always like expressed from the standpoint of climate change will put added stress on water resources throughout the world. And of course, that is really a concern, and we're seeing how this plays out all over. But at that point, the impact that water has on climate was not even in the conversation. And so I wanted to bring it into the conversation, and I'm excited that these conversations are now happening, as in this one. So if we step back and ask the question, how does the planet manage heat? We will see that it is mostly through water-based processes, primarily the phase changes of water, which embody tremendous transfers of heat energy. So yes, let's bring water into the climate conversation from the perspective of how we can work with water to address climate change. Specifically, let's look at the water process of transpiration, in which water moves upward through plants and is released as water vapor. Now, liquid water turned to a gas phase of water. Ever boil hot water on a stove? So we know that this requires energy. It uses or consumes energy. Therefore, this is a cooling mechanism. Plants are dissipating solar energy, transforming it into a latent form of heat embodied in water vapor, as opposed to sensible heat or heat you can feel, like, if you step on a hot sidewalk. According to Jan Pokorny, a botanist from the Czech Republic and one of the authors of the book, the small book that completely blew me away when I read it several years ago, the book, The New Water Paradigm, Water for the Recovery of the Climate. So Jan Pokorny says that the transpiration capacity of one good-sized tree on a sunny day can have 3 times the cooling power of an air conditioning system in a five-star hotel. There is a quote I like from water innovator Peter Andrews from Australia. He says, almost haiku-like, that plants manage water, and in managing water, they are managing heat. Now that's something you might want to kind of sit with a second, because there's a lot in those few words. Again, I'll just say it again. Plants manage water, and in managing water, they are managing heat. He notes also that we have effectively devegetated about 1/4 of the planet, thereby destroying that heat regulating capacity. Yet this also points to where we have agency to revegetate degraded landscapes, to restore this regulation function. We can do this. In the aggregate, trees move around an extraordinary quantity of water. Brazilian scientist Antonio Donato Nobre describes forest-driven aerial rivers, bodies of moisture that sail unnoticed through the sky. He says airborne waterways above the Amazon rainforest contain more water than the Amazon River below. That's a lot of water. In an essay called Clouds, Rachel Carson wrote, "Up there is another ocean, the air ocean that envelops the whole globe." To a large extent, weather comes down to the agency of trees. Trees cast out moisture, they're transpiring and they're sending this aerial river, through the atmosphere. But they also pull it in. According to a theory called the biotic pump, the cumulative transpiration of trees in a forest forms a low pressure zone. This creates a vacuum which draws in moisture. The laden air cools and condenses over the forest, and we have rain. So a healthy forest is at once sending water abroad and tugging water in from elsewhere. It is a dynamic system as moisture both rides the current and creates it. So we have a scenario where trees and clouds are talking to each other. So one more point before I turn it over to the others, and that is the connection between water and biodiversity. So it's understood that all life depends on water, but it's also important to recognize that water also depends on life. For example, we've got all that moisture in the atmosphere, the aerial rivers. What brings that water, that moisture back to Earth? This happens through condensation, the process in which water molecules gather or condense to form clouds, fog, and dew. To create rain, there needs to be another element, some tiny speck for that raindrop to condense around. Nature, life, provides a variety of precipitation nuclei. That would include ice crystals, bacteria, fungal spores, pollen, scented compounds emitted from trees. Antonio Nobre calls these latter molecules scents of the forest or fairy dust. And so clouds and vegetation become partners in rain. We can think of this as an important element of the small, or really it kind of is the small water cycle. Water cycling in place, rising as vapor and descending as precipitation. In a healthy ecosystem, water stays where it falls so that a single raindrop can circulate numerous times before leaving the area. Water depends on life in another important way, in that the presence and activities of multiple species slows down water so that it can meander and sink into the ground as opposed to just running off and disappearing. Think of beavers whose dams slow water and create wetlands that support multiple other species, or prairie dogs who dig tunnels that allow water to flow and remain in dry landscapes, or even the humble earthworm who makes pathways for water in the soil. And so climate is largely driven by water processes, and water processes are largely driven by life. It's not helpful then to look at water in isolation, because water is always in relation. So on that score, I will leave you with a quote from Spanish meteorologist and atmospheric physicist. And anyway, he's like got zillion PhDs, this fellow, Mian, who I had the pleasure of spending a few days with in 2018. He says, water begets water, soil is the womb, and vegetation is the midwife. So water, soil, vegetation. This gives us our mission to preserve and restore healthy ecosystems so that we can ally with water and thrive. So thank you to all. I look forward to engaging with the rest of the conversation. Thanks.
Wow, thank you, Judith. That was incredible. It's so much to digest there. And I mean, everything from you talk about the cooling effects of evapotranspiration. I think back to when I was living in New York City and the feeling in the summertime of being in Manhattan amid that urban heat island effect, where the concrete would increase the sensible heat off of the sidewalk, sometimes 15 to 20 degrees higher than the actual temperature was. And then you cross into Central Park and it would actually be 15 degrees cooler than it was in the sidewalk, or sometimes even cooler than the rest of the ambient air temperature. And so when we talk about the importance of those cooling effects, I think a lot about our urban areas, and so many of them are designed with insufficient canopy to provide that effect. My question for you, Judy, is, you've written a few books on the topic, and I think so much of what you're talking about and how we accomplish these things, how we accomplish the hydro literacy that is necessary to transform society. I think so much of it comes down to right, like what the policy is, how do we convince policymakers that these incentives are greater than, for example, the material and monetary incentive of deforestation, things like that. And so for me, it comes down to, okay, how do we shift policy? We shift policy through culture, and we shift culture through storytelling. And you're a storyteller. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about maybe some advice that folks on the call on this talk can take away in terms of how we talk about these things to our friends and neighbors and colleagues, because it takes all of us, each in our places. Most of the land that has been degraded is also privatized, and so it's like it takes this parcel by parcel approach of people who are on land. Yeah, can you talk a bit about the storytelling aspect?
Wow. Well, I guess, I mean, that's a huge question. How do we, do this huge cultural, societal shift? But I guess I would say, and this is something that stories do, is, well, okay, invite people's curiosity and also speak to people's kind of inherent understanding. I think that people intuitively understand this, how water works, once you draw attention to it. We've got our heads stuffed with like concentrations of CO2, with what this person is saying, what that person is arguing, so we often don't see what is in front of us. But if you talk to people and say, hey, just what you said, hey, it's really interesting that I remember when I was living in New York and the concrete was just soaking in the heat, and how wonderful it was to go to where there were plants. And hey, maybe this is something that we can do and maybe we can do together. And if these are people in your community, talk about what might be possible for you there. So I think it's just engaging in conversations, not trying to convince, but inviting in. Because I really do, like I said, I really do think this is intuitive because we've all had these experiences. We know that it feels good to be around plants. We humans evolved in relation to healthy ecosystems and plants. So it's in us. And it's just a matter of inviting that back.